My wife asked, "If I died, would you even cry?" I said, "Probably not." She was found dead 8 hours later, and I'm facing murder charges. We were sitting in our kitchen on a Thursday evening, eating reheated lasagna that Claire had made 3 days earlier, when she asked the question. I was scrolling through work emails on my phone, barely paying attention to her presence across the table. She had been talking about something related to her mother's upcoming birthday party, and I was giving her the occasional grunt of acknowledgement while reading about a client dispute that needed resolution before morning. Claire stopped mid-sentence and asked, "If I died, would you even cry?" I looked up from my phone just long enough to see her staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I said, "Probably not." Then I went back to my email. She stood up without another word, took her plate to the sink, and walked upstairs. I heard our bedroom door close. I finished my dinner alone, responded to 4 more emails, and fell asleep on the couch watching a documentary about World War II submarines. When I woke up at 2 in the morning, Claire was not in bed. Her car was gone from the driveway. The police found Claire's body at 6:30 that morning in the parking lot behind Sterling Industrial Park, slumped over the steering wheel of her sedan with a gunshot wound to the chest. A security guard doing his morning rounds had seen the car with its engine still running and called it in. By 8 o'clock, 2 detectives were standing in my living room, asking why I had not reported my wife missing during the night. I told them I had assumed she went to stay with her sister after our argument. Detective Raymond Booker, a heavy man in his 50s with tired eyes, asked what we had argued about. I explained it was not really an argument, just a weird question she had asked during dinner. His partner, Detective Lisa Moreno, younger and sharper, asked me to repeat the question and my response. When I told them, Booker wrote something in his notebook, and Moreno's expression changed in a way that made my throat tighten. They asked if I owned any firearms. I said no. They asked where I was between 10 at night and 6 in the morning. I said home, asleep, alone. No witnesses. Moreno asked if anyone could verify that. I said obviously not because I lived with Claire, and she was the only person who would have been here. They took me to the police station for a formal statement. The interview room smelled like industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Booker sat across from me while Moreno leaned against the wall near the door with her arms crossed. Booker asked me to walk through the entire evening in detail, starting from when I got home from work. I told them I arrived around 6:15. Claire was already cooking. We ate around 7. She asked the question. I gave my answer. She went upstairs. I fell asleep on the couch. Booker asked why I did not go check on her before falling asleep. I said we had been married for 8 years and sometimes she needed space when she was upset. Moreno asked if Claire was upset often. I said no more than anyone else, just normal relationship stuff. Booker asked if I had ever threatened Claire or been violent with her. I said absolutely not, never. Moreno asked if Claire had ever expressed fear of me. I said no, because there was nothing to fear. Booker asked if our marriage was happy. I said it was fine, normal, nothing extraordinary, but nothing terrible either. Moreno asked what I meant by nothing extraordinary. I said we had settled into routine, work and dinners and weekends, the usual progression of a long marriage. Booker pulled out his phone and showed me text messages between Claire and her sister, Diane, from 2 weeks earlier. Claire had written, "He doesn't even see me anymore. I could disappear, and he wouldn't notice for days." Diane had responded, "That's not okay. You deserve better than being invisible." Claire had replied, "I don't know what to do. I've tried talking to him, but he's always working or distracted. I feel like I'm living with a stranger." The messages continued with Diane suggesting marriage counseling and Claire saying she had brought it up twice, but I had dismissed it as unnecessary. Booker asked if I remembered Claire asking about counseling. I said vaguely. Maybe she had mentioned it, but I had been dealing with a major case at the firm and had not had time to think about scheduling appointments. Moreno asked what I did for work. I said I was a corporate litigation attorney at Whitman and Associates downtown. She asked if my work often took priority over my marriage. I said my work paid for our house and our life, so yes, sometimes it had to take priority. They showed me more messages, these ones from the night before Claire died. She had texted Diane at 9:45 saying, "He just told me he probably wouldn't cry if I died. I asked him directly and that's what he said." Diane had responded immediately. "What? Are you serious?" Claire wrote, "I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I need to get out of here." Diane replied, "Come stay with me tonight. Pack a bag and come over." Claire's last message, sent at 10:03, said, "I'm leaving now. I'll explain everything when I get there." Booker asked why Claire never arrived at Diane's house. I said I had no idea because I had been asleep. Moreno asked if I had tried to stop Claire from leaving. I said I did not even know she was leaving because I was on the couch. Booker asked if I heard her car start or the garage door open. I said no because I was asleep and our bedroom was on the opposite side of the house from the garage. Moreno asked how I could fall asleep so easily after my wife had clearly been upset. I said I was exhausted from work and had not realized she was that upset. They released me after 3 hours with instructions not to leave town. I drove home to find news vans, parked on my street, and reporters standing on my lawn. A young woman with blonde hair shoved a microphone toward my car window, asking if I had any comment on my wife's murder. I said nothing, and pushed through to my front door. Inside, my phone was ringing constantly. Claire's mother, Patricia, screaming at me that I had killed her daughter. Claire's father, Gordon, calling to tell me I was a monster. Diane leaving voicemails saying she had told Claire to leave me months ago, that she had seen the signs of emotional abuse, that I had destroyed her sister's spirit before someone finished the job. I turned off my phone and sat in the silence of the house that suddenly felt enormous and empty. The kitchen still had Claire's coffee mug on the counter from yesterday morning, her reading glasses on the table, her jacket hanging by the door, evidence of a life that had ended while I slept. The story hit the news that evening. Local attorney's wife found murdered, husband under investigation. They used our wedding photo, both of us smiling in formal attire, Claire's dark hair pulled back, my arm around her waist. The news anchor reported that sources close to the investigation said the husband had made callous remarks about his wife's death hours before she was killed, that there was evidence of marital discord, that he had no alibi for the time of the murder. They interviewed a neighbor, Mrs. Pemberton, from 3 houses down, who said she had always thought I seemed cold and detached, that she rarely saw me and Claire together, that she was not surprised to hear about problems in our marriage. My phone started receiving calls from reporters asking for interviews. My work email filled with messages from colleagues expressing shock and offering support that felt hollow. The senior partner at my firm, Douglas Whitman, called to say I was being placed on immediate leave until the situation resolved itself. My father arrived from Boston the next morning with a criminal defense attorney named Julian Cross. Julian was in his 60s, white hair, expensive suit, reputation for getting wealthy clients acquitted of serious charges. He sat in my living room and asked me to tell him everything without leaving out any details, no matter how small or damaging they might seem. I walked him through the entire timeline again. When I got to my response about not crying, Julian closed his eyes briefly and exhaled through his nose. He asked if there was any possibility Claire had been seeing someone else, if our marriage had issues beyond my emotional distance. I said, not that I knew of, but clearly I had not been paying attention to much of anything in her life. Julian asked if I had any enemies, anyone who might want to frame me or hurt Claire to get to me. I said I was a litigation attorney. I had plenty of people who disliked me professionally, but nothing that would lead to murder. The police executed a search warrant on our house that afternoon. They photographed every room, bagged Claire's laptop and phone, took my computer, collected our financial records, searched through drawers and closets looking for anything incriminating. They found a handwritten journal in Claire's nightstand that Booker flipped through while standing in our bedroom. He read several passages aloud for the recording. March 3rd. Tried to talk to him about us tonight. He barely looked up from his laptop. I don't think he loves me anymore. Not sure he ever did. April 15th. Made his favorite dinner, wore the dress he used to say he loved, sat across from him while he checked his phone for an hour. I'm invisible. May 22nd. Asked him if he even remembered our anniversary next month. He said he had it in his calendar. That's what I've become. A calendar entry. Booker asked if I had read any of these entries. I said I did not know the journal existed. He asked how I could live with someone and not know they were documenting their misery. I had no answer. They found financial records showing Claire had opened a separate bank account 3 months earlier and had been transferring money from our joint account into it. Small amounts. $200 here, $300 there, building up to almost $8,000. Moreno asked if I had known about this account. I said no. She asked if I monitored our finances. I said I paid the bills and assumed everything else was fine. She asked if it concerned me that my wife was hiding money. I said it concerned me now, but I had not known about it then. Booker suggested Claire had been planning to leave me and had been setting aside escape funds. Julian interrupted to say that was speculation and not evidence of anything criminal. Booker said it was evidence that Claire had been afraid enough to plan a secret exit, which established motive for me to stop her from leaving. The autopsy report came back 3 days later. Claire had been shot once in the chest from close range with a 9mm handgun. Time of death estimated between 10:30 at night and midnight. No signs of sexual assault, no defensive wounds, no indication she had struggled with her attacker. The gunshot residue patterns suggested she had been shot while sitting in the driver's seat of her car. The bullet had been recovered and sent for ballistics analysis. Toxicology showed no drugs or alcohol in her system. The medical examiner noted that the angle of entry suggested the shooter had been standing outside the driver's side door, slightly elevated, possibly on the curb. Security footage from Sterling Industrial Park showed Claire's car entering the parking lot at 10:18. No other vehicles followed her in. No footage showed anyone approaching her car. The camera angles had blind spots that a person could have used to approach unseen. Booker came to my house with a warrant for my arrest 6 days after Claire died. He read me my rights, while Moreno cuffed my hands behind my back. Julian was already there, having anticipated this moment. News cameras captured everything as they walked me to the police car. Someone in the crowd of reporters shouted, "Did you kill your wife?" I kept my eyes down and said nothing. The arraignment happened the following morning. I stood before Judge Catherine Wells in an orange jumpsuit, while the prosecutor, a sharp woman named Ellen Graves, argued that I should be held without bail. She said I was a flight risk with financial resources and professional connections. She said the evidence showed premeditation, that my own words proved I had no emotional attachment to the victim, that I had motive and opportunity. Julian argued that circumstantial evidence was not proof, that I had cooperated fully with the investigation, that I had strong ties to the community and no criminal history. Judge Wells set bail at $1 million. My father posted it using his retirement funds and his house as collateral. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Julian spent that time building our defense while I stayed in my father's house in Boston, unable to return to my own home because of the media circus. He hired a private investigator named Frank Delacroix, former FBI agent, to examine every aspect of Claire's life in the months before her death. Frank discovered that Claire had been seeing a therapist, Dr. Grace Winters, starting in January. Dr. Winters initially refused to share her notes, citing client confidentiality, but Julian got a court order compelling her to turn over records relevant to Claire's state of mind. The notes painted a picture of a woman suffering from severe depression and loneliness within her marriage. Dr. Winters had diagnosed Claire with major depressive disorder and had prescribed medication that Claire had been taking inconsistently. The notes included references to Claire feeling suicidal at times, though she had never expressed intent or plan. Dr. Winters had recommended intensive therapy and marriage counseling. Claire had attended 7 sessions before stopping in April. Frank also found that Claire had been spending significant time at a coffee shop called Morning Brew, going there almost daily during her lunch breaks from her job as a graphic designer. The owner, a man named Carlos Ruiz, remembered Claire as a regular customer who always sat in the corner booth and worked on her laptop for hours. Carlos said Claire had been friendly but quiet, occasionally chatting with other regulars, but mostly keeping to herself. Frank interviewed those regulars and found that one of them, a man named Derek Holloway, had developed a friendship with Claire over the past few months. Derek was a freelance photographer in his 30s, divorced, living alone in an apartment downtown. Frank tracked him down and asked about his relationship with Claire. Derek said they had bonded over both being in creative fields and both feeling stuck in their lives. He said they had coffee together, several times, always at Morning Brew, always during the day, nothing romantic or inappropriate. Frank asked if Derek had feelings for Claire. Derek admitted he had found her attractive and interesting, but said Claire had made clear she was married and not looking for anything beyond friendship. Julian brought this information to Booker and Moreno, suggesting Derek as an alternative suspect. Moreno said they had already interviewed Derek the day after Claire's body was found. He had provided them with his whereabouts that night, home alone working on editing photos for a client. No alibi, but also no evidence connecting him to the crime. Booker said Derek's phone records showed no communication with Claire on the day she died. No calls, no texts, no indication they had plans to meet. Julian argued that Derek could have followed Claire when she left her house, that his interest in her could have turned dangerous when she rejected him. Ellen Graves, present for this meeting, said the timeline did not support that theory. Claire had left her house at 10:05, according to her text to Diane. Her car entered Sterling Industrial Park 13 minutes later. If someone had followed her, they would have needed to act quickly and decisively. The location itself made no sense as a meeting spot. It was an industrial area with no businesses open at night, nothing that would draw Claire there deliberately. The preliminary hearing arrived, and Judge Wells heard arguments about whether sufficient evidence existed to proceed to trial. Ellen presented the case methodically. She established that Claire had been unhappy in her marriage, that she had expressed feelings of invisibility and emotional abandonment, that she had been planning to leave me. She presented my statement about not crying if Claire died, made hours before her actual death, as evidence of my emotional detachment and possible premeditation. She noted that I had no alibi for the time of the murder and that Claire had been killed shortly after leaving our house following that conversation. She presented evidence that Claire had been shot with a 9mm handgun and that while no weapon had been recovered, my finances showed a cash withdrawal of $800 2 weeks before the murder, money that was unaccounted for and could have been used to purchase an illegal firearm. She argued that the prosecution would prove I had killed Claire to prevent her from leaving and possibly claiming half of our assets in a divorce. Julian countered by highlighting the lack of physical evidence. No gun recovered, no gunshot residue on my hands or clothing, no witnesses placing me at the scene, no forensic evidence in Claire's car linking me to the crime. He argued that Claire's unhappiness, while tragic, did not prove I killed her. He suggested that Claire's emotional state made her vulnerable to others, that her friendship with Derek Holloway represented a blind spot in the investigation, that the police had focused on me immediately and stopped looking for other possibilities. He presented phone records showing that Claire had received 3 calls from an unknown number in the week before her death, calls that lasted several minutes each. The police had traced the number to a burner phone purchased with cash that had never been recovered. Julian argued this suggested someone else had been in contact with Claire, possibly threatening her or manipulating her. Judge Wells found sufficient probable cause to bind me over for trial. The trial began on a Monday in early October, 4 months after Claire's death. The courtroom was packed with reporters, Claire's family in the first row behind the prosecution, my father sitting alone behind the defense table. The jury selection had taken 3 days, resulting in 7 women and 5 men, mostly middle-aged professionals. Ellen's opening statement portrayed me as a narcissistic workaholic who had emotionally abused my wife for years, driving her to depression and desperation, and who had killed her rather than face the embarrassment and financial consequences of divorce. She promised to prove that my words predicted my actions, that my opportunity aligned with the time of death, that my lack of emotional response revealed my guilt. Julian's opening focused on reasonable doubt. He said the prosecution's case was built entirely on speculation and circumstantial evidence, that being a bad husband did not make someone a murderer, that the real killer remained free because the police had rushed to judgment. Ellen called Diane as her first witness. Diane described Claire as her best friend and closest confidant, said they talked every day, that Claire had shared everything about the deterioration of her marriage. She read the text messages between them aloud, her voice breaking when she got to Claire's final message about leaving that night. She testified that Claire had been scared of me in the final weeks, not physically afraid, but emotionally desperate to escape. Julian's cross-examination established that Claire had never reported any violence or threats from me, that Diane had never personally witnessed me being cruel to Claire, that her opinions were based solely on Claire's subjective descriptions of her feelings. Patricia and Gordon testified next, describing their daughter as vibrant and loving, saying I had gradually dimmed her light over the years. They said I had isolated Claire from her family, that we rarely attended gatherings, that I always seemed annoyed when Claire wanted to visit them. Julian got them to admit that I had never prevented Claire from seeing them, that she had visited them regularly without me, that their perception of isolation was based on my absence rather than Claire's restriction. Dr. Winters testified about Claire's mental state, describing severe depression stemming from marital loneliness. She read excerpts from session notes where Claire described feeling invisible, unheard, unloved. She said Claire had expressed feelings of worthlessness, but had been working on rebuilding her self-esteem. Julian's cross-examination focused on Claire's suicidal ideation. He got Dr. Winters to confirm that Claire had mentioned thoughts of death multiple times, that depression created risk factors for self-harm, that Claire's emotional instability could have made her vulnerable to dangerous situations or people. Ellen objected repeatedly, arguing that Julian was attempting to blame the victim. Judge Wells allowed the testimony, but warned Julian about overstepping. The prosecution called their forensic expert, Dr. Alan Kemper, who testified about the gunshot wound and the physical evidence from the scene. He described the angle and range of fire, the lack of defensive wounds, the position of Claire's body in the driver's seat. Ellen asked if the evidence was consistent with Claire knowing her killer. Dr. Kemper said the lack of struggle suggested she had not perceived immediate threat, that the shooter had gotten close enough to fire through the open driver's side window or door. Julian's cross-examination established that the evidence was equally consistent with a stranger approach, that nothing definitively proved Claire had known the person who shot her. Booker and Moreno testified about the investigation, walking through their interviews with me, the evidence collected, the timeline established. Julian grilled them about the burner phone calls to Claire, asking why they had not pursued that lead more aggressively. Booker said they had investigated but found no connection to anyone in Claire's life, that burner phones were dead ends by design. The second week of trial focused on the prosecution's circumstantial case. Ellen called co-workers from my law firm who testified that I was obsessed with my work, that I frequently stayed late at the office, that I rarely mentioned my wife in conversations. She called neighbors who said they never saw me and Claire together, that we seemed to live separate lives under the same roof. She called the owner of a gun range an hour outside the city, who testified that someone matching my description had come in 6 months earlier, asking about renting firearms and learning to shoot. The owner said he could not be certain it was me, but the time frame and physical description matched. Julian destroyed this testimony on cross-examination, establishing that the owner had only come forward after seeing my picture on the news, that he had no records or surveillance footage to confirm the visit, that hundreds of men could match a vague description of height and build. Ellen called a forensic accountant who detailed our finances, showing that divorce would have cost me approximately half of our assets, roughly $400,000 in home equity and retirement accounts. Julian countered by showing that my income was sufficient to rebuild those assets over time, that financial motive alone proved nothing. Julian began the defense case by calling Derek Halloway. Derek testified about his friendship with Claire, describing her as lonely and sad, someone looking for human connection her husband was not providing. Julian asked if Derek had romantic feelings for Claire. Derek admitted he had been attracted to her but respected her marriage. Julian asked about the night Claire died. Derek said he had been home alone editing photographs, that he had no reason to be at Sterling Industrial Park, that he barely knew where it was located. Julian introduced Derek's phone records, showing no contact with Claire that day. Ellen's cross-examination was brutal. She asked if Derek had been frustrated by Claire's unwillingness to leave her marriage for him. Derek said there was no relationship to leave for. Ellen suggested Derek had been obsessed with Claire, that when she rejected him, he had followed her that night and killed her. Derek denied it emphatically. Ellen asked why the police should believe a man with no alibi who admitted being attracted to the victim. Derek had no good answer. Julian called Carlos Ruiz from Morning Brew, who testified that Claire had seemed sad but never afraid, that her friendship with Derek had been innocent, that he had never seen anything inappropriate between them. Julian called 3 other regulars from the coffee shop who confirmed seeing Claire and Derek talking but never touching, never showing signs of romantic involvement. Ellen's cross-examination established that none of them knew what Claire and Derek discussed in private, that their observations were superficial. Julian called Frank Delacroix, who testified about his investigation into Claire's life, the burner phone calls, the possibility of unknown threats. Ellen objected repeatedly, arguing that Frank's speculation was not evidence. Judge Wells sustained most objections, limiting what Frank could say. Julian's defense felt thin, circumstantial in its own way, lacking the concrete alternative suspect needed to create real, reasonable doubt. The prosecution's rebuttal focused on destroying any alternative theory. Ellen recalled Booker, who testified that Derek had been thoroughly investigated and cleared, that the burner phone calls had led nowhere, that every piece of evidence pointed back to me. She called a criminal psychologist, Dr. Neil Harper, who testified about intimate partner homicides. He said that statistically the spouse was the perpetrator in the vast majority of cases, that emotional abuse often escalated to physical violence, that my statement about not crying if Claire died demonstrated the psychological detachment typical of perpetrators who had already made the decision to kill. Julian objected furiously, arguing that statistics and profiles were not evidence of my specific guilt. Judge Wells allowed the testimony with instructions to the jury about its limited purpose. Ellen's closing argument tied everything together. She walked through the timeline of Claire's unhappiness, my emotional neglect, Claire's decision to leave, my callous statement, her death hours later. She said the evidence proved beyond reasonable doubt that I had killed my wife rather than lose control of my life and assets. Julian's closing argument focused entirely on doubt. He said the prosecution had not proven I left my house that night, had not proven I owned a gun, had not proven I was at Sterling Industrial Park, had not proven anything except that I was a bad husband. He said being emotionally distant was not the same as being a murderer. He reminded the jury that the burden of proof rested entirely on the prosecution, that if they had any reasonable doubt about my guilt, they must acquit. He spoke for 90 minutes, methodical and thorough, but I could see the jury's faces and knew it was not enough. They deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the forewoman was a woman in her 50s, named Margaret Shaw, who had sat stone-faced throughout the trial. Judge Wells asked if they had reached a verdict. Margaret said yes. The court clerk asked me to stand. Julian stood beside me, his hand on my shoulder. Margaret read from the paper in her trembling hand. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree." The courtroom erupted. Patricia screamed, "Yes!" and collapsed into Gordon's arms. Diane sobbed loudly. My father sat motionless, staring at the floor. The bailiffs moved toward me immediately. Julian was saying something about appeals, about fighting this, but I could barely hear him over the noise. Judge Wells banged her gavel, demanding order. She set sentencing for 3 weeks later and remanded me into custody. They handcuffed me and led me toward the side door. As I passed Claire's family, Gordon stood and said, "You took everything from us. I hope you rot in prison." Patricia spat at me, the saliva hitting my cheek before a bailiff stepped between us. The cameras outside captured me being led to the transport van. That image would be on every news channel by evening. Convicted attorney found guilty of murdering wife after callous remark about her death. The story had its ending. I was the villain. Claire was the tragic victim. Justice had been served. County jail was worse this time, knowing I would not be leaving. My cellmate was a man named Leon who was awaiting trial for armed robbery. He asked what I was in for. I said murder. He asked if I did it. I said no. He laughed and said everyone here was innocent. I spent 3 weeks reviewing the trial transcripts Julian brought, looking for grounds for appeal. He said the criminal psychologist's testimony might be arguable as prejudicial, that the judge's rulings on some of our evidence might have been too restrictive, but that our chances were minimal. Appellate courts rarely overturned jury verdicts based on evidentiary rulings that fell within the judge's discretion. My best hope was that new evidence would emerge proving my innocence. I asked what kind of evidence. He said a confession from the real killer, new forensic analysis contradicting the prosecution's timeline, something definitive that could not be ignored. I asked how likely that was. He said very unlikely. Sentencing day arrived. Judge Wells asked if I wanted to make a statement before she imposed sentence. Julian advised against it, but I stood and faced Claire's family. I said I did not kill Claire, that I had been a terrible husband but not a murderer, that I was sorry for my failures and would spend the rest of my life living with the guilt of not seeing her pain before it was too late. Patricia shouted, "Liar!" Gordon told me to shut up. Judge Wells banged her gavel. She said she had reviewed the evidence and the jury's verdict, that the crime was particularly heinous because it involved the betrayal of marital trust, that I had shown no remorse beyond self-serving denials. She sentenced me to life in prison without possibility of parole. The bailiffs took me away while Claire's family cheered. I was transferred to Greenfield Correctional Facility the next day, a maximum security prison 4 hours north of the city. I was assigned to Cell Block D, Cell 18, with a new cellmate named Marcus, who was serving 20 years for manslaughter. Prison was everything I had heard and worse. Violence simmered constantly beneath the surface. Guards were indifferent at best, cruel at worst. Food was barely edible. Days blended into each other with nothing to distinguish them except the occasional fight in the yard or lockdown after someone was stabbed. Julian visited once a month with updates on the appeal. After 6 months, he said the appellate court had denied our motion for a new trial. We could appeal to the state Supreme Court, but he was not optimistic. My father visited less frequently, the drive and the emotional toll wearing him down. He looked older each time, grayer and more defeated. He said he believed in my innocence, but did not know how to prove it. I told him to stop wasting his retirement on appeals that would go nowhere. He said he would never stop fighting for me. 2 months later, he died of a heart attack in his sleep. The prison allowed me to attend his funeral in shackles, guards on either side of me while a handful of his friends and colleagues sat in the pews avoiding eye contact. I stood at his grave knowing I had destroyed his final years with my failure. I spent 2 years in Greenfield before anything changed. I worked in the prison library, shelving books and helping other inmates with legal research. Most of them were guilty and knew it, working on technicalities and procedural arguments hoping for reduced sentences. Some maintained innocence, their cases full of questionable evidence and dubious testimony, reminding me that the system failed more often than anyone wanted to admit. One afternoon in November, an inmate named Troy Washington approached me asking for help with his case. Troy was serving 15 years for armed robbery of a convenience store. He said he was innocent, that he had been at a friend's house during the robbery, but the friend had refused to testify because of outstanding warrants. I reviewed his file and saw the same patterns I recognized from my own case: circumstantial evidence, questionable witness identifications, police pressure to close a case quickly. I helped Troy draft a motion for post-conviction relief. 2 months later, a guard told me I had a visitor. The visitor was not Julian. It was a woman in her early 30s, professional attire, sharp eyes behind thin glasses. She introduced herself as Amanda Pierce, investigative journalist for the Capital Review newspaper. She said she had been researching cases of potential wrongful convictions and had found irregularities in mine. I asked what irregularities. She said the burner phone that called Claire in the days before her death had bothered her because the police had dismissed it too easily. She had connections with telecommunications experts who had examined the records more carefully. The burner phone had been purchased at a convenience store in South Heights, a neighborhood across town from where Derek lived, but only 6 blocks from Sterling Industrial Park. Amanda had obtained surveillance footage from the store showing the purchase. The buyer was wearing a hood and kept their face down, but their build and gait had caught her attention. She had shown the footage to a forensic video analyst who enhanced the images. The analyst believed the buyer was a woman based on body proportions and movement patterns. Amanda said she had started investigating women in Claire's life who might have had motive to harm her. She had discovered that Dr. Grace Winters, Claire's therapist, had been investigated 3 years earlier for inappropriate relationships with clients. 2 former patients had filed complaints with the state licensing board alleging that Dr. Winters had become emotionally entangled with them, crossing professional boundaries by meeting outside therapy sessions, sharing personal information, becoming possessive when they tried to end treatment. The board had issued a reprimand, but allowed Dr. Winters to continue practicing with supervision. Amanda had tracked down one of those former patients, a woman named Kelly Brennan, who described Dr. Winters as obsessive and manipulative. Kelly said Dr. Winters had become fixated on her relationship problems, had encouraged her to leave her husband, had suggested they could provide each other with the support and understanding no one else could offer. When Kelly had recognized the inappropriate dynamic and found a new therapist, Dr. Winters had called her repeatedly, shown up at her workplace, sent letters expressing devastation at the abandonment. Amanda had obtained Dr. Winters' financial records through sources she would not name. The records showed significant debt, credit cards maxed out, mortgage payments behind. Amanda had also found that Dr. Winters had no appointments scheduled on the night Claire died, unusual because she typically worked evening sessions on Thursdays. Amanda had interviewed Dr. Winters under the pretense of writing a feature story about mental health treatment. During the conversation, Amanda had mentioned Claire's case. Dr. Winters had become defensive, saying Claire had been a deeply troubled patient who had not followed treatment recommendations, that Claire's death was a tragedy, but not surprising given her mental state. Amanda had asked if Dr. Winters had been surprised when I was arrested. Dr. Winters had said the spouse was always the most likely suspect in cases like this. Amanda had asked if Dr. Winters had any doubt about my guilt. Dr. Winters had said none whatsoever, that she had seen the warning signs in her sessions with Claire, that I had been emotionally abusive and dangerous. Amanda said Dr. Winters' certainty had struck her as odd because therapists were usually more measured in their statements, more aware of the complexity of human behavior. Amanda had done more digging and found that Dr. Winters' car, a dark gray sedan, had been captured on a traffic camera 3 blocks from my house at 9:52 on the night Claire died, driving in the direction of Sterling Industrial Park. The timestamp was 8 minutes before Claire's car had entered the park. Amanda had pulled phone records and found that Dr. Winters had called Claire from her personal cell phone at 9:30 that night, a call lasting 4 minutes. Dr. Winters had not disclosed this call to the police. Amanda asked me if I knew about any call between Claire and Dr. Winters that night. I said no, that the police had never mentioned it, that it had not come up at trial. Amanda said that was because the police had not looked carefully at Dr. Winters' records, had accepted her statement that she had no contact with Claire that day, had not verified it against phone records. Amanda had confronted Dr. Winters with this information. Dr. Winters had initially claimed the call was a routine check-in because she had been worried about Claire's mental state. When Amanda had pointed out that calling a patient at 9:30 at night was highly unusual, Dr. Winters had said she had been concerned Claire might be in crisis. Amanda had asked why Dr. Winters had not mentioned this concern to the police. Dr. Winters had ended the interview and refused further contact. Amanda said she had enough for a story that would raise serious questions about my conviction, but she wanted my permission to publish it and wanted to know if I had any additional information that might help. I told her everything I could remember about Claire's therapy, which was very little because Claire had not discussed her sessions with me. I said that was one of many failures in our marriage, my lack of interest in her healing process. Amanda said she would publish the story the following week and would send a copy to Julian to support a new appeal. The story ran on the front page of the Capitol Review under the headline, "Wrongful Conviction, New Evidence Suggests Therapist May Have Killed Patient." The article detailed Amanda's findings about Dr. Winters' history, financial problems, presence near my house and Sterling Industrial Park on the night of the murder, an undisclosed phone call to Claire. The story went viral. Other news outlets picked it up. Television stations ran segments questioning my conviction. Claire's family released a statement saying they had faith in the jury's verdict and believed Amanda was being manipulated by a murderer seeking to escape justice. Ellen Graves held a press conference defending the conviction, saying Amanda's theories were speculation without evidence, that Dr. Winters had been investigated at the time of trial and cleared. Julian filed an emergency motion for a new trial based on newly discovered evidence. The motion argued that Dr. Winters' phone call and proximity to the crime scene were material facts that had been withheld from the defense, that this evidence created reasonable doubt about my guilt and required further investigation. Judge Wells held a hearing on the motion 3 weeks later. Amanda testified about her investigation, presenting the phone records, traffic camera footage, and interviews with Kelly Brennan. Julian argued that the prosecution had failed to disclose Dr. Winters' phone call to Claire, despite it being potentially exculpatory evidence. Ellen Graves argued that the phone call had been a brief check-in with no evidentiary value, that traffic camera footage showing Dr. Winters' car in the general area proved nothing because it was a public road, that Amanda's story was sensationalized journalism without forensic backing. Judge Wells took the matter under advisement. 2 weeks later, she issued a ruling denying the motion for a new trial. She wrote that while the evidence presented by Amanda was interesting, it did not meet the legal standard for newly discovered evidence because it could have been found through due diligence before trial, and it did not definitively prove my innocence or Dr. Winters' guilt. Julian immediately appealed the ruling. The appellate process took 8 months. During that time, Amanda continued investigating. She tracked down the convenience store clerk who had sold the burner phone and showed him enhanced images from the surveillance footage. The clerk said he could not be certain, but he thought he remembered the customer because she had been nervous and fidgety, had paid cash without making eye contact, had asked specifically for a phone that could not be traced. Amanda obtained Dr. Winters' credit card records showing purchases at a gas station near Sterling Industrial Park on 3 occasions in the 2 weeks before Claire died, suggesting she had been surveilling the area or planning something. Amanda found a former colleague of Dr. Winters who said Dr. Winters had talked obsessively about a patient she was treating for marital problems, had expressed anger that the patient's husband did not appreciate what he had said someone should teach him a lesson. The colleague had not thought much of it at the time because therapists often expressed frustration about clients' situations, but in retrospect, the comments seemed darker. The appellate court issued its decision on a Friday afternoon. They overturned Judge Wells' denial of a new trial, ruling that the combination of Dr. Winters' undisclosed phone call, her presence near the crime scene, her history of boundary violations with patients, and her financial desperation created sufficient new evidence to warrant further proceedings. They remanded the case back to the trial court with instructions to hold an evidentiary hearing to determine whether Dr. Winters should be investigated as a suspect. Julian called the prison with the news. I felt something I had not felt in 3 years. Hope. The evidentiary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. Booker and Moreno were ordered to reopen the investigation into Dr. Winters. They executed search warrants on her home, office, and car. In her home office, they found a box of documents hidden in the back of a closet. The box contained printed copies of Claire's therapy notes, far more detailed than what had been turned over during discovery. The notes described Dr. Winters' growing emotional attachment to Claire, her anger at me for not valuing Claire, her fantasies about rescuing Claire from the marriage and building a life together. The notes also contained entries from the week before Claire died. She is finally ready to leave him. I have to make sure she follows through this time. She cannot go back to that prison. Called her tonight to check in. She sounded scared but determined. I told her I would support her no matter what. She needs to know someone truly cares. She texted saying she is leaving tonight. I am so proud of her. This is the beginning of her real life. The final entry, dated the night Claire died, said, I cannot let this opportunity slip away. If I don't act now, she might change her mind again. He does not deserve her. He never did. Booker also found a 9mm handgun hidden inside a heating vent in Dr. Winters' basement. Ballistics testing confirmed it was the weapon that had killed Claire. Dr. Winters was arrested at her office the following morning while meeting with a patient. She was charged with first-degree murder. I was released from prison pending the resolution of her case. Walking out of Greenfield was surreal. Julian was waiting in the parking lot with Amanda, who had brought a photographer to document the moment. I stood in sunlight for the first time in 3 years without walls around me, feeling both liberated and lost. The world had continued, without me. My father was dead. My career was destroyed. My reputation was ruined. My wife was still gone. Julian drove me to a hotel where reporters were already gathering for a press conference. Amanda had arranged for me to make a statement. I stood at a podium with microphones pointed at me and cameras recording every word. I said I was grateful for the truth finally emerging, that I had always maintained my innocence, that I hoped Dr. Winter's prosecution would bring some measure of justice for Claire. I said I had been a terrible husband, but not a murderer, that my failures had contributed to Claire's vulnerability, but had not caused her death. I said the system had failed both of us, Claire by not protecting her from someone who was supposed to help her, and me by rushing to judgment without examining all possibilities. Dr. Winter's trial began 4 months later. The prosecution, now led by a different attorney because Ellen Graves had recused herself, presented the case methodically. They established that Dr. Winters had become obsessively attached to Claire, viewing their therapeutic relationship as something more personal. They presented the hidden notes showing Dr. Winters' emotional entanglement and her anger toward me. They presented the phone call from Dr. Winters to Claire at 9:30 on the night Claire died, with testimony from phone company experts establishing that the call had lasted 4 minutes and had been made from Dr. Winters' personal cell phone. They presented traffic camera footage showing Dr. Winters' car near my house and then driving toward Sterling Industrial Park, minutes before Claire's car had appeared on cameras heading the same direction. They argued that Dr. Winters had called Claire telling her to meet at the park, possibly claiming she had information about me or offering a safe place to talk. They presented the gun found in Dr. Winters' basement with ballistics matching the bullet that killed Claire. Dr. Winters' defense attorney argued that the gun had been planted, that the notes had been taken out of context, that therapists often wrote subjective observations that sounded inappropriate when read without professional understanding. They argued that Dr. Winters had no motive to kill Claire, that she had genuinely cared about her patient's well-being. The prosecution countered with testimony from Kelly Brennan and another former patient who described Dr. Winters' pattern of becoming possessive and unstable when patients tried to establish boundaries or leave treatment. They argued that Dr. Winters had killed Claire in a moment of desperate obsession, unable to accept that Claire was leaving to stay with her sister, rather than running to Dr. Winters for salvation. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before finding Dr. Winters guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. I attended the sentencing hearing and watched as she was led away, her face expressionless. Claire's family refused to speak to me even after the conviction. Patricia and Gordon maintained that I bore responsibility for Claire's death through my emotional abuse, that Dr. Winters might have been the one who pulled the trigger, but I had created the circumstances that made Claire vulnerable. Diane sent me a letter saying she would never forgive me for not seeing what Claire needed, for not fighting harder to save their marriage, for being absent when Claire needed someone most. I did not argue with them. They were right in their own way. I had failed Claire long before Dr. Winters entered her life. My negligence had not killed her, but it had contributed to the desperation that made her seek help from someone who turned out to be more dangerous than the loneliness she was trying to escape. I settled the wrongful conviction lawsuit against the city for an undisclosed amount and used the money to establish a foundation in Claire's name, supporting domestic violence and mental health resources. It felt inadequate, but necessary. 5 years after Claire's death, I was living in a small apartment in a different city, working as a consultant for Innocence Projects helping other wrongfully convicted prisoners. Amanda and I remained in contact, her investigation having created an unlikely bond between us. She had won a National Journalism Award for her coverage of the case. Julian had retired but occasionally consulted on appeals. I thought about Claire every day, about the question she had asked and the answer I had given. Would I cry if she died? The truth was, I had cried more in the years since her death than I had in our entire marriage. I cried for her suffering, for my blindness, for the life we could have had if I had been present enough to see what was happening. I cried for my father who had spent his final years fighting for a son who had never appreciated him. I cried for the time lost and the chances wasted. The words I had spoken that night in our kitchen haunted me, not because they predicted murder, but because they revealed a truth about who I had been. Someone so emotionally disconnected that his wife's death seemed abstract, theoretical, something that would barely register in his self-absorbed existence. I had been acquitted of murder but would never be innocent of that. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.